Sometimes the most desperate moments lead us to the most extraordinary destinations. In the bustling corridors of a fashion fair in New York, Grace found herself face to face with her worst nightmare, her toxic ex-boyfriend. In a moment of pure panic, she did something unthinkable. She hugged a complete stranger and whispered, "Pretend you know me." She had no idea that this stranger would change everything she thought she knew about love, success, and herself. But what happened next? No one there could have imagined. If this story moves you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this from? Your support is what keeps this channel alive. The deafening noise of the New York International Textile and Fashion Fair echoed through the corridors of the Javits Center like a chaotic symphony of ambitions and dreams. Grace Mitchell adjusted the strap of her vintage bag on her shoulder, feeling the weight of the fabric samples she carried so carefully. The smell of strong coffee mixed with the expensive perfume of executives walking past her created an atmosphere that made her feel simultaneously energized and intimidated. She had woken up at 5 in the morning in that tiny hostel room in Brooklyn, mentally rehearsing every word she would say to potential buyers. Her hands still trembled slightly, not from nervousness but from pure adrenaline. This was the moment she had dreamed of since she learned to sew on her grandmother's lap at 7 years old. "You've got this, Grace," she murmured to herself, taking a deep breath of the air conditioning that carried the scent of new fabrics and expectations. "You were born for this." The main corridor was buzzing with life. International buyers walked briskly, their heels echoing on the marble floor as they spoke in languages she could barely identify. Grace watched an elegant woman with perfectly styled hair, gesticulating animatedly on the phone in French. Another, wearing a leather coat that probably cost more than Grace made in 3 months, examined silk samples with the precision of a surgeon. That's when she saw him. Ryan. Grace's stomach plummeted as if she had just jumped off a ledge. He was only 50 feet away, impeccably dressed in a navy blazer she recognized. It was a gift she had chosen for him last year, when she still believed they were a team. Ryan wasn't alone. A blonde woman, obviously an influencer, judging by her calculated mannerisms and the artificial smile she flashed while posing for photos, was glued to his arm like an extension of his ego. Grace recognized the face immediately. Sophia Laurent, the same influencer Ryan had chosen over her, the same one who had appeared all over his social media with the caption, "Complete upgrade." "No, no, no," Grace whispered, feeling the blood drain from her face. Her legs felt like jelly. Ryan was approaching, his eyes scanning the environment with that familiar arrogance. In seconds, he would see her. In seconds, she would have to face that sarcastic smile, that voice that had once told her she would never be anything more than a neighborhood seamstress. Panic washed over Grace like a cold wave. She looked around desperately, searching for an exit, a bathroom, anywhere to hide. But the corridor was too crowded, and Ryan had already started to turn his head in her direction. That's when she saw him, a tall man with his back to her, carefully observing a showcase of sustainable fabrics. He wore a perfectly tailored gray suit that screamed quality and sophistication. His brown hair had an impeccable cut, and there was something about his posture, confident but not arrogant, that made her make a completely insane decision. Without thinking twice, Grace walked quickly toward the stranger. Her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. With slightly trembling arms, she hugged him from behind, whispering close to his ear, "Please, pretend you know me. My ex is coming our way and I can't face him right now." The man turned slowly within her embrace, and Grace found herself looking directly into the most intense eyes she had ever seen. They were a deep green, like the color of the sea on a stormy afternoon, and for a moment that seemed eternal, she felt completely mesmerized. He showed no surprise. He didn't push her away. Instead, a gentle, understanding smile spread across his lips. "Of course," he said, his voice low and comforting with an accent that suggested refined education. "It's been so long, Grace." She blinked, surprised. How did he know her name? But before she could process the information, she heard the hated voice behind her. "Grace? Grace Mitchell?" She turned slowly, still wrapped in the stranger's protective arm. Ryan was just a few steps away, with an expression of genuine surprise on his face. Sophia was beside him, clearly bored and checking her phone. "Ryan," Grace replied, her voice firmer than she expected. "What a coincidence running into you here." "Coincidence?" Ryan laughed, that laugh she had once found charming and now recognized as condescending. "What are you doing at a fair of this level? It's not exactly your natural environment, is it?" Grace felt the stranger's arm tighten slightly around her waist, a subtle but comforting gesture. She looked quickly at him and saw something in his eyes that reassured her. He wasn't just pretending, he was genuinely on her side. "Grace is here as my guest," the stranger said, his voice carrying a natural authority that made Ryan step back. "We're exploring some very interesting collaboration opportunities." "Collaboration?" Ryan repeated, his eyes narrowing as he studied the man beside Grace. "And you are?" "Christopher," he replied simply, extending his hand with the confidence of someone who doesn't need to explain himself. Christopher Bennett. The name clearly meant something to Ryan because his expression changed instantly. His eyes widened slightly and he straightened his shoulders, assuming that posture Grace knew well, the one he used when he wanted to impress someone important. "Bennett? From Bennett Collective?" Ryan stammered slightly. "The same," Christopher confirmed, his tone casual as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Grace felt her legs go weak again, but this time it wasn't from fear. Bennett Collective. She knew the company. Who in the fashion world didn't? It was one of the largest sustainable fashion companies in the United States, known for revolutionizing the industry with ethical practices and innovative designs. "Well, Ryan clearly didn't know how to react. He looked at Grace with an expression she had never seen before, something between respect and confusion. "I didn't know you two knew each other." "Life surprises us," Grace said, finding courage in Christopher's solid presence beside her. "Sometimes the best connections happen when we least expect them." Sophia finally looked up from her phone, clearly irritated by the delay. "Ryan, honey, we can't miss our appointment with the Vogue people," she said, her voice loaded with artificial impatience. Ryan nodded absent-mindedly, but his eyes remained fixed on Grace and Christopher. Of course," he said. "Well, Grace, it was a pleasure seeing you. And Mr. Bennett, it's an honor to meet you." Christopher just nodded politely, keeping his arm around Grace's waist. When Ryan and Sophia finally walked away, Grace realized she had been holding her breath. She turned to Christopher, ready to thank him and apologize for the bizarre situation, but the words died on her lips when she really looked at him. He was devastatingly handsome. Not in Ryan's obvious, calculated style, but in a more mature, more substantial way. There were lines of experience around his green eyes, and something in his expression suggested genuine depth and intelligence. She began, feeling her face flush. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what got into me. Hugging a stranger like that, it was completely insane of me." Christopher smiled, a smile that completely transformed his face and made Grace's heart race for completely different reasons than fear. "Don't apologize," he said softly. "Sometimes we all need an unexpected hero. The question is, what do we do when the act is over?" Grace stared at him, trying to decipher what lay behind those words. There was something in his tone, something that suggested this conversation was far from over. Grace walked alongside Christopher through the fair corridors, still feeling the adrenaline from the encounter with Ryan pulsing through her veins. The sound of heels on marble created a hypnotic rhythm as they moved away from the denser crowd. She could smell his subtle cologne, something woody and masculine that made her want to breathe more deeply. "Are you okay?" Christopher asked, his voice filled with genuine concern. He had slowed his pace, allowing her to process what had just happened. Grace laughed, but it was a humorless sound, heavy with years of poorly healed pain. "Honestly, I don't know if I've been okay for a long time," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. There was something about his presence that made her want to lower the defenses she had so carefully built. They stopped near a display case, showcasing organic fabrics in earthy tones. Grace ran her fingers along the glass surface, watching her fragmented reflection. "May I ask what happened?" Christopher positioned himself beside her, his hands in his pockets, respecting her personal space while still maintaining enough closeness for her to feel protected. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to travel back in time. The memories came like a flood, sweet at first, bitter at the end. I grew up in Pilsen, a humble neighborhood in Chicago, she began, her voice low and reflective. My grandmother, Rosa, raised me after my parents died in an accident when I was 5. She was a seamstress, worked from 5 in the morning until 10 at night mending clothes for the neighbors. Christopher turned completely toward her, his green eyes intensely focused on every word. I remember the smell of her house, Grace continued, a melancholic smile playing on her lips. It always smelled like new fabric, sewing machine oil, and the cheap perfume she wore on Sundays to go to Mass. She taught me that every stitch had a soul, that sewing wasn't just putting pieces of cloth together, but creating something that could make someone feel special. She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman, Christopher commented softly. She was, Grace confirmed, her voice catching. She died when I was in college, studying fashion design on a scholarship that barely covered basic expenses. She left me her sewing machine and a notebook full of drawings she never had the chance to turn into reality. They began walking again, passing by international designers' booths. Grace observed the sophisticated creations, the prices that cost more than she made in 6 months, the distance between that world and hers. It was right after Grandma died that I met Ryan, she continued, her voice taking on a harder tone. I was vulnerable, lost, trying to figure out how to pay rent and still keep dreaming. He appeared in my life like some kind of savior. Christopher remained silent, allowing her to find her own words. Ryan had just started as a lifestyle influencer. He wasn't famous yet, but he had enough ambition for 10 people. He said he loved me, that he wanted to help me achieve my dreams. He convinced me to drop out of college and focus on the brand we were building together. Grace stopped in front of a wall mirror, observing her reflection next to Christopher's. They made an interesting contrast, she with her simple but well-tailored clothes, he with his natural and understated elegance. At first, it seemed like a fairy tale, she admitted, her voice heavy with irony. Ryan had grand ideas about how we would become the power couple of sustainable fashion. He would be the public face, I would be the creative genius behind the brand. Power couple goals, he always said. But things changed, Christopher observed, not as a question, but as someone who recognized the signs of a story he had seen repeated many times. Grace nodded bitterly. Little by little, my name started disappearing from the credits. It became Ryan's brand, Ryan's visionary ideas. I became the girlfriend who sewed well, the creative accessory that validated his authenticity. When I questioned it, he said it was marketing strategy, that audiences connected better with one strong main figure. She turned to Christopher, her eyes shining with contained tears. I believed him, because I wanted to believe, because I was in love, and because I was afraid that alone I would never be able to leave the neighborhood where I grew up. Ryan made me feel like I needed him to be someone in the world. And how did it end? Christopher asked gently. Grace laughed, but the sound was loaded with pain. Publicly and humiliatingly, of course. Ryan had grown on social media, had almost 200,000 followers. One day he simply posted photos with Sophia Loren, you saw her today, saying he had found his creative soulmate. The caption said something like, "Sometimes we need to make upgrades in life to reach our true potential." Christopher clenched his fists, and Grace noticed the tension in his jaw. "Bastard," he murmured, so low she almost didn't hear it. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal, Grace continued, her voice now firmer. It was discovering that he had registered our brand under his name. All the designs I had created, all the ideas we had developed together, legally they were his. I was left with nothing. No boyfriend, no brand, no money, and no rights to my own work. They stopped near a rest area. Christopher sat beside her on a cushioned bench, maintaining a respectful but comforting distance. "How long were you together?" he asked. 3 years, Grace replied, running her hands through her hair. 3 years of my life invested in someone who saw me as a disposable tool. When we broke up, I was 24 years old. No degree, no money, no self-esteem. I went back to Chicago and spent a whole year working in a fabric store, trying to gather the courage to dream again. "But you're here," Christopher observed, his eyes meeting hers. "That means you found that courage." Grace smiled for the first time since they had started talking, a genuine smile that completely transformed her face. I did. It took a very long time, many nights crying, lots of work in therapy to understand that I wasn't the problem. That I was always good enough, talented enough, strong enough. I just needed to stop looking for validation from others. And your current brand? Christopher asked, genuinely interested. Hopeware, Grace said, her voice filling with pride for the first time. In honor of Grandma Rosa, that's how she used to sign the notes she left in my school lunch. With hope and love, Grandma Rosa. Every piece I create carries that philosophy, that clothing should give hope, make the person feel powerful, regardless of where they came from. Christopher smiled, and Grace felt something stir in her chest, a sensation she hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the desperate, needy feeling she had felt for Ryan, but something deeper, more solid. And you? She asked, realizing she had talked for too long about herself. How does someone like you end up saving desperate strangers at fashion fairs? Christopher laughed, a rich and genuine sound. That's a story for another time, he said, standing up and offering his hand to her. First, how about showing me those Hopeware creations? I have a feeling you have much more to offer than you imagine. Grace looked at his outstretched hand, hesitating for just a second. There was something about that gesture that seemed loaded with possibilities, not just romantic, but professional, personal, transformative. She took his hand, feeling the firmness and warmth of his fingers wrapping around hers. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, the universe was giving her a second chance to believe that good people still existed in the world. Grace guided Christopher through the less crowded corridors of the fair, their footsteps echoing more softly on the polished floor. The nervousness began growing in her chest again as they approached the emerging designer's wing, a smaller, less glamorous section where dreams were still fragile and bets desperate. Here it is, she said, stopping in front of a small, modest booth between two much more elaborate companies. To the left, a French brand displayed their creations on mannequins lit by professional spotlights. To the right, an Italian label occupied a space 3 times larger, with leather armchairs for visitors to sit comfortably. Hopeware's booth, in comparison, looked like a market stall. Grace had only managed to get a folding table, 2 plastic chairs and a small screen where she hung her 6 best pieces. There was no special lighting, no elegant armchairs. There was only passion materialized in carefully chosen fabrics and hand-sewn pieces. Sorry for the simplicity, Grace murmured, feeling her face heat up with embarrassment. In Christopher's presence, the modesty of her space seemed even more glaring. Christopher didn't respond immediately. Instead, he approached the displayed pieces with an attention Grace didn't expect. His fingers delicately touched the sleeve of a blazer cut from organic linen, examining the seams with the eye of someone who truly understood the craft. This is handmade work, he observed, more to himself than to her. Everything is, Grace confirmed, her voice gaining strength as she spoke about her work. Each piece is unique. I only use sustainable fabrics, organic linen, recycled cotton, some bamboo fibers I managed to import from a small producer in Brazil. Christopher picked up a blouse that seemed simple at first glance, but revealed sophisticated details as he examined it more closely. The seams were impeccable, the finishes perfect, and there were small, discreet embroideries that told their own story. How long does it take you to make a piece like this? He asked, genuinely interested. It depends, Grace replied, moving closer to him. This blouse, for example, took 42 hours, 15 just for the embroidery. Each flower represents something. This one is for strength, this one for hope, this one for new beginnings. She pointed to the small details she had created by hand, her fingertips still marked by needle pricks from the last months of intensive work. And how did you manage to be here? Christopher asked, turning to face her. A fair of this level must cost $8,000, Grace completed, laughing nervously. Just the registration, not counting transportation, accommodation, food. It was all my savings from the last 2 years, plus a loan I'm not sure how I'm going to pay back. Christopher frowned, clearly surprised by the amount. I worked nights at a bakery for a year and a half, Grace continued, nervously organizing the pieces on the screen. From 3 to 9 in the morning, every day. Then I'd go home, sleep 3 hours and sew until late at night. Weekends, I did alterations for neighbors for $20 each. Why risk so much? Christopher asked, his voice gentle but filled with genuine curiosity. Grace stopped what she was doing and looked directly into his eyes. For a moment, she saw in them not the CEO of a million-dollar company, but simply a man trying to understand a decision that would seem insane to many. Because I knew that if I didn't try now, I never would, she replied with an honesty that surprised her. After what happened with Ryan, I spent a whole year wondering if I really had talent or if it had just been an illusion. If my grandmother was right when she said I had a gift, or if it was just her love making me see things that didn't exist. She sat in one of the plastic chairs, suddenly feeling the weight of all those months of exhausting work. One night, I was fixing the hem of a dress for Mrs. Martinez, my neighbor, and she started crying. I asked if it was hurting, if the needle had pricked her, but she said no. She said it had been 20 years since she felt beautiful, and that my work had made her remember what it was like to look in the mirror and like what she saw. Christopher sat in the chair next to her, his attention completely focused on the story. That's when I decided, Grace continued. I thought, if I can make one person feel like that with a simple dress hem, what can I do if I really try? If I stop being afraid and bet everything on what I believe in? And you really did bet everything, Christopher observed, looking around the small booth. Literally, Grace laughed, but there was pride in her voice. I sold my car. It wasn't worth much, but it was transportation. I cancelled my health insurance for 6 months. I basically lived on instant noodles and eggs. But every sacrifice seemed worth it when I saw a piece being completed. She got up and walked to the screen, delicately touching a skirt that seemed to float in the air. This skirt here, for example, she said, her eyes shining. It's made with organic cotton I got from a women's cooperative in Tennessee. The cut is inspired by the skirts my grandmother wore to dance when she was young, but adapted for a modern woman who needs to move, work, live. Christopher approached, examining the piece more closely. You have a story for each one of them, he observed. All of them, Grace confirmed, because they're not just clothes, they're pieces of hope materialized in fabric. Each one was created thinking of a specific woman, the executive who wants to feel powerful but feminine, the mother who lost her identity and wants to find herself again, the young woman starting her career and needs confidence. She stopped in front of the blazer Christopher had examined first. This blazer, for example, was inspired by a photo of my grandmother in the 1950s. She wore a similar one when she went to the first seamstresses union meeting. She told me she had never felt so nervous and powerful at the same time. I wanted to create something that would give today's women that same feeling. And does it work? Christopher asked, a smile playing on his lips. There's only one way to find out, Grace replied, looking at her watch. My presentation is in 2 hours. I'm going to show the collection to a panel of judges, magazine editors, international buyers, executives like you. Christopher noticed the hesitation in her voice. You're nervous, he observed. Terrified, Grace admitted. I invested 2 years of my life and all my resources in this moment. If it goes wrong, what if it goes right? Christopher interrupted gently. Grace looked at him, surprised by the question. For months she had focused so much on the possible consequences of failure that she had rarely allowed herself to imagine success. If it goes right, she said slowly, I proved to myself that I was right, that all the sacrifice was worth it, that Grandma Rosa wasn't wrong when she said I had something special. And then, Grace smiled, and for the first time since arriving in New York, the smile reached her eyes. Then I changed the world, one stitch at a time. Christopher laughed, a rich sound that made her feel lighter. You know what? He said, looking again at the displayed pieces. I have a feeling you're going to do exactly that. Grace felt her heart race, not from nervousness about the approaching presentation, but from the way Christopher looked at her, as if he saw something in her that she herself was still learning to recognize. The Meridian Auditorium was packed when Grace entered through the side door, carrying her single suitcase with the 6 pieces carefully folded in tissue paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she observed the audience. About 200 people, all impeccably dressed, all appearing to belong to that world in a way she never would. The stage in front of her seemed immense under the professional lights. 3 large screens displayed the fair's logo, and a runway extended for almost 30 feet, flanked by professional photographers adjusting their cameras. The smell of expensive perfumes mixed with air conditioning created an atmosphere that made her feel simultaneously energized and nauseous. Next presenter, Grace Mitchell from Hopeware, announced a young producer with a headset, checking her clipboard. You have exactly 12 minutes, 6 pieces, 2 per minute, plus 2 minutes for questions from the judges. Grace nodded, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. 12 minutes to present 2 years of work, all her passion, all her sacrifices. In the front row, she identified the panel of judges who would decide her fate. Helena Moreau, editor-in-chief of Sustainable Fashion Quarterly, an elegant woman in her 50s who hadn't smiled even once. Marcus Browning, chief buyer at Bloomingdale's, constantly checking his phone with a bored expression. Vivian Chen, an executive from a major fast fashion brand, taking notes on a tablet with quick, efficient movements. And in the center, presiding over the table, was David Kellerman, a man known for destroying careers with a single phrase, owner of one of the largest fashion consulting firms in the United States. His reading glasses hung on his chest, and he looked at Grace with the same expression one uses to observe a curious specimen in a laboratory. Breathe, Grace murmured to herself, adjusting the blazer she had chosen to wear, one of her own creations, in earth-colored linen with discreet embroidery on the sleeves. You were born for this. In the stands, she searched for Christopher and found him a few rows back, his green eyes focused on her with an expression of silent encouragement. Just seeing him there made her heart calm slightly. Grace Mitchell, you have the stage, the producer announced. Grace climbed the 3 steps to the stage, her legs shaking so much she feared she would stumble. The lights intensified, creating a dramatic contrast between the brightness of the stage and the darkness of the audience. For a moment, she felt completely exposed, as if every flaw, every insecurity was amplified under those merciless lights. Good afternoon, she began, her voice coming out lower than intended. My name is Grace Mitchell, and I'm here to present Hopeware. David Kellerman didn't look up from his notes. Hopeware was born from the belief that fashion can be a force for personal and social transformation, Grace continued, gaining a bit more confidence as the words flowed. Each piece is created by hand, using only sustainable materials and techniques that honor both the environment and the women who will wear these clothes. She gestured to the first model, a young woman she had managed to hire for just $100 for the entire presentation. The model emerged from the wings wearing the blazer Christopher had admired earlier. This piece represents quiet strength, Grace explained, her voice gaining passion. Inspired by the women who paved the way before us, it's made from organic linen with embroidery that tells stories of resistance and hope. Helena Moreau finally looked up, but her expression remained neutral. Marcus Browning didn't even lift his eyes from his phone. The second piece emerged, the blouse with floral embroidery that had taken 42 hours to complete. Each flower embroidered on this piece has meaning, Grace explained, feeling passion inflame her voice. They're not just decorations, but symbols of growth, renewal, and women's ability to flourish under any circumstance. That's when David Kellerman finally spoke. Miss Mitchell, he said, his voice cutting through the air like a cold blade, stop for a moment. Grace felt her blood freeze in her veins. Interruptions during presentations were never a good sign. Yes, sir, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Can you tell us what your academic background in fashion is? Kellerman asked, removing his glasses and cleaning them with deliberately slow movements. Grace felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. I studied fashion design at the University of Illinois for 2 years, but I didn't complete the program, she admitted, her voice dropping in volume. Didn't complete, Kellerman repeated, as if he was savoring the words. And what's your professional experience in the industry? Have you worked for any recognized brands? Had mentorship from established designers? My experience is more hands-on, Grace tried to explain, feeling her confidence drain away like sand through fingers. I learned from my grandmother, who was a seamstress, and developed my skills over years creating custom pieces for custom pieces, Helena Moreau interrupted, her voice loaded with poorly disguised disdain. You're presenting what are essentially domestic tailoring jobs to us, as if they were haute couture. Low laughter echoed from the audience, like poisonous whispers that pierced Grace's heart. "No, She tried to defend herself, but Vivian Chen had already taken up the attack. "Let's talk about pricing," Chen said, consulting her notes. "Your prices are completely unviable for the market. Who's going to pay $800 for a blouse that takes 40 hours to make? That's not economically sustainable. It's naive romanticism." "But the quality," Grace began, desperate. "Quality is irrelevant if no one can buy it," Marcus Browning finally spoke, without taking his eyes off his phone. "Fashion is a business, not occupational therapy." The words hit Grace like physical slaps. She felt her legs go weak and fought to maintain composure, while tears burned behind her eyes. David Kellerman leaned forward, like a predator preparing for the final blow. "Miss Mitchell, what you've brought us today is quaint," he said, the word sounding like an insult. "It's the type of work we might find at a local craft fair. There's no commercial vision, no market understanding, no real innovation, just sentimentality applied to fabrics." The silence in the auditorium was deafening. Grace could feel 200 pairs of eyes on her, some compassionate, others curious to see how she would react to the public massacre of her dreams. "You clearly have manual skills," Helena Moreau added, her voice loaded with condescension. "Perhaps you should consider a career in vintage clothing restoration or sewing work for theater. But this here," she gestured vaguely toward the pieces on the runway, "this is not professional fashion." Grace looked at her creations, the pieces into which she had poured her soul, her sleepless nights, her tears and hopes. Under the merciless stage lights and the cruel judgment of the judges, they seemed exactly what the judges said they were. Amateur work, naive dreams of someone who didn't understand how the real world worked. She began, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? How could she defend something that, at that moment, she herself was beginning to question? "Thank you, Miss Mitchell," David Kellerman said with finality. "That will be all." Grace stood on the stage for a few seconds that seemed eternal, the weight of humiliation pressing on her shoulders like a physical burden. She looked at the audience and met Christopher's eyes. There was something in his expression, not pity, but an intensity she couldn't decipher. "Thank you," she managed to whisper into the microphone before leaving the stage with wobbly legs. Backstage, she leaned against the cold wall, finally allowing the tears to fall. Every word from the judges echoed in her mind like a hammer, systematically destroying 2 years of work, of hope, of courage. Maybe Ryan was right. Maybe she would never be more than a neighborhood seamstress, with dreams too big for her reality, too small. She collected her pieces mechanically, folding them back into the tissue paper with automatic movements. She couldn't even look at them properly. They were evidence of her naivety, symbols of a failure that now seemed inevitable from the start. When she finally emerged from backstage, Grace avoided any eye contact with the dispersing audience. All she wanted was to disappear, return to Chicago, accept that some dreams were simply impossible for people like her. But as she walked quickly toward the exit, she didn't know that someone in the audience had seen something completely different from what the judges had described. 3 days had passed since the presentation. 3 days that Grace spent locked in the tiny hostel room in Brooklyn, alternating between crying fits and the emotional emptiness of someone who had their dreams publicly shattered. The musty smell of the cheap mattress mixed with the aroma of Chinese food rising from the restaurant on the ground floor created an atmosphere that perfectly matched her state of mind. She had changed her flight back to Chicago 3 times, always finding an excuse to postpone the inevitable return home, and to the reality that she had bet everything and lost. The suitcase with her 6 creations remained closed in the corner of the room. She couldn't even look at the pieces without feeling a wave of shame and self-loathing. Her phone had rung dozens of times, messages from friends in Chicago asking how the fair had gone, emails from some small stores interested in her pieces. Cruel irony, considering she now questioned whether they had any real value. Grace ignored everything, lost in a cycle of self-criticism that seemed endless. On the morning of the 4th day, a firm knock on the door pulled her from the torpor she had sunk into. "Grace! Grace, I know you're in there." The voice was unmistakable. Christopher. Grace looked at herself in the fogged mirror of the tiny bathroom. Her eyes were swollen from so much crying, her hair tangled, and she had been wearing the same clothes for 2 days. He was the last person she wanted to see her in that state. "Grace, please, I need to talk to you." She hesitated, her hand on the doorknob. Part of her wanted to ignore him, pretend she wasn't there, avoid the consoling conversation that would surely come. But there was something in his voice, an urgency that went beyond mere politeness, that made her open the door. Christopher was in the narrow hallway, elegant even in jeans and a casual shirt. He carried 2 coffee cups and a paper bag that smelled of fresh bread. When their eyes met, Grace saw in them not the pity she expected, but something that surprised her. Respect. "May I come in?" he asked softly. Grace stepped back, allowing him to enter the cramped space. He made no comments about the modest room or her appearance. Instead, he placed the coffee and bread on the only available table and turned to face her. "How did you find me?" Grace asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "I asked at the fair reception where you were staying," he replied simply. "It wasn't difficult." They stood in silence for a moment. Grace sat on the edge of the bed, wrapping her arms around her knees, as if trying to protect herself from the outside world. "You don't need to be here," she finally said. "I know you must have more important things to do than console failed designers." Christopher approached and knelt in front of her, forcing Grace to look into his eyes. "Oh, you didn't fail," he said, his voice loaded with an intensity that made her stop breathing for a second. "You were there," Grace replied bitterly. "You heard everything they said. Quaint, naive romanticism, domestic tailoring work. I heard blind people trying to diminish something that threatened their limited visions of what fashion should be," Christopher replied, his voice gaining strength. "I heard people who forgot that true art always scares those who have settled into mediocrity." Grace looked at him, confused. This wasn't what she expected to hear. "Christopher, be honest with me," she said, tears beginning to well up again. "Maybe they were right. Maybe I'm just a romantic seamstress who doesn't understand how the real world works." Christopher stood up abruptly and went to the suitcase in the corner of the room. "May I?" he asked, pointing to the stored pieces. Grace hesitated, then nodded. She watched as he carefully opened the suitcase and removed the linen blazer with embroidery on the sleeves. His hands touched the fabric with the same reverence she had noticed at the fair. "Do you know what I saw when you got on that stage?" Christopher asked, still holding the piece. "I saw a woman who had the courage to bet everything on something she believed in. I saw someone who didn't conform to the status quo and decided to create something new, even knowing she would be judged." He turned to her, the blazer still in his hands. "And you know what else I saw? I saw the future of sustainable fashion. I saw artisanal techniques that the industry lost in the race for mass production. I saw narratives embroidered in fabric, stories that connect the wearer with something greater than themselves." Grace slowly stood up, walking to where he was. "But they said it wasn't commercially viable." "They said that because they don't know how to make it viable," Christopher interrupted her. "Because they're trapped in old models that treat clothes as disposable products." "But you're creating something different. You're creating heirlooms, Grace, pieces that women will pass down to their daughters." He carefully placed the blazer on the bed and took her hands in his. "Do you want to know the truth about why I was at that fair?" he asked. Grace nodded, mesmerized by the intensity in his green eyes. "I was looking for exactly you, not you specifically, but someone like you, someone who understood that fashion can be more than profit and seasonal trends. Someone who saw clothing as a way to empower women, not oppress them with impossible standards." "I don't understand," Grace whispered. Christopher released her hands and began pacing around the small room, as if organizing his thoughts. "Bennett Collective is at a moment of transition," he explained. "We've grown a lot in the last 5 years, but growing means making decisions. We can continue being just another sustainable fashion company, competing for the same customers with similar products, or we can become something revolutionary." He stopped and looked directly at her. "I want to revolutionize. I want to create a platform that connects designers like you with the world. I want to show that it's possible to make conscious fashion without sacrificing quality or narrative. I want women to buy clothes that have soul, not just expensive labels." Grace felt something stir in her chest, a spark of hope she thought had been completely extinguished. "Why me?" she asked. "You could work with famous designers, people with proper training, with commercial experience. Because they've already been molded by the system, Christopher replied, without hesitation. Because they learn to create within limitations you don't even know exist. Because you still have the courage to believe that clothes should tell stories, not just follow trends. He approached again, his voice becoming softer, more intimate. Grace, what you did on that stage was brave, vulnerable. You showed your soul to people who forgot they had one. That's not failure. That's pure courage. Grace felt the tears return, but this time they weren't tears of defeat. They were tears of relief, of hope being reborn in a chest that had given up on dreaming. "What are you proposing?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Christopher smiled, that smile that completely transformed his face and made her heart race. "I'm proposing that you let me help show the world what I saw on that stage," he said. "I'm proposing that we create something together, something that honors your vision, but also reaches the people who need to hear it." Grace looked at her creation spread over the bed, then at Christopher. There was something in his expression that went beyond professional interest. There was a genuine belief in her, a faith she had lost in herself. "What if I fail again?" she asked, vulnerable. "Then we'll fail together," Christopher replied, extending his hand to her. "But I have a feeling that what's coming is very far from being a failure." Grace looked at the outstretched hand, knowing that accepting it would mean more than a professional partnership. It would mean believing again. It would mean betting on herself a second time, but this time, not alone. 6 months later, Grace was standing in the center of the most beautiful studio she had ever worked in. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Manhattan, and the natural light flooding the space made the fabrics organized on the shelves shine like precious jewels. The smell of fresh cotton mixed with the aroma of coffee that Christopher brought every morning had become as familiar as breathing. "What do you think of this combination?" Grace asked, holding 2 fabrics against the light. One was organic linen in terracotta tone, the other silk produced by a women's cooperative in the interior of São Paulo. Christopher looked up from the sustainability reports he was reviewing. Even after all these months working together, Grace still felt a small acceleration in her chest when he directed all his attention to her. "Show me how it looks against your skin," he suggested, approaching the work table where she had spread her ideas for the Modern Roots collection. Grace held the fabrics against her neck, observing her reflection in the window. The woman looking back was almost unrecognizable from the one who had left Chicago with a suitcase of dreams 6 months ago. Her eyes sparkled with a confidence she didn't know she possessed, and there was something in her posture, more upright, more determined, that spoke of someone who had found her place in the world. "Perfect," Christopher murmured, but when Grace looked at him, he wasn't observing the fabrics. He was looking at her. For a moment, the air between them became charged with an electricity they could no longer ignore. They had become partners, friends, confidants, but there was something more growing between them, something neither dared to name. "Christopher," Grace began, but was interrupted by the entrance of Maria Santos, one of the artisans they had hired to work on the collection. "Grace, mija, you need to see what Carmen managed to do with that embroidery you designed," Maria said, her voice loaded with enthusiasm. She held a blouse that seemed to have been touched by magic. Grace took the piece and examined it carefully. The embroidery she had sketched on paper had transformed into something even more beautiful than she had imagined. Carmen, a 60-year-old woman who had been embroidering since she was 12, had added her own details that elevated the design to a new level. "She said the inspiration came from the story you told about your grandmother," Maria continued, "about how she embroidered hope into every stitch." Grace's eyes filled with tears. Not tears of sadness, but of deep gratitude. In 6 months, they had created not just a collection, but a family. 5 women, Maria, Carmen, Rosa, Elena, and Luz, all with stories of struggle and overcoming, all contributing their unique skills to transform Grace's designs into reality. "It's perfect," Grace whispered, tracing the delicate stitches with her fingertips. "No, Grace, it's ours," Maria corrected, smiling. "You taught us that every stitch carries a story. Now we're sewing our stories together with yours." Christopher watched the scene with an expression Grace had learned to recognize. It was the look of someone who knew they were witnessing something special, something that went far beyond business or profits. "Maria, can you call the others?" Christopher asked. "We have news about the runway show." In the following minutes, the studio filled with animated voices in Spanish and English, laughter echoing off the high walls, and the sound of sewing machines that never completely stopped. Grace had discovered that creating wasn't a solitary act. It was a symphony of talents harmonizing. "Ladies," Christopher said when everyone was gathered around the main table, "I have the pleasure of confirming that we've been accepted at the Metropolitan Fashion Hall." The silence that followed was broken by shouts of joy and applause. Rosa, the youngest of the group at just 22, began to cry. Elena hugged Carmen, who was murmuring prayers in Spanish. "Metropolitan Fashion Hall," Grace repeated, still processing the information. It was one of the most prestigious venues in New York for fashion shows, the same place where major designers launched their most important collections. "October 18th, Christopher continued, smiling as he observed the women's reaction. "Main runway. 200 confirmed seats, including journalists from 16 countries. Grace sat heavily in a chair, suddenly feeling the weight of responsibility. 6 months ago, she was destroyed in a hostel room. Now she was about to present her collection on one of the most important stages in the fashion world. "Can I do this?" she asked, more to herself than to others. "We can do this," Christopher corrected, kneeling beside her chair, "and it's going to be extraordinary." In the weeks that followed, the studio transformed into a center of feverish but organized creation. Grace had learned so much about production, timing, and team management that she sometimes surprised herself with her own evolution. Christopher was always present, not as a boss, but as a mentor and partner, teaching her about business aspects she had never considered. "Let's talk about storytelling," he said one afternoon, while they reviewed the runway show script. "Every model who walks down that runway needs to tell part of the bigger story." Grace nodded, taking notes in her notebook, the same one where she had drawn her first ideas for Hopewear. "The Modern Roots collection talks about women who honor their origins without being limited by them," she said, repeating the concept they had developed together. "Each piece represents a phase of the feminine journey, from the girl who dreams to the woman who achieves." "And which piece represents where you are now?" Christopher asked, his green eyes fixed on hers. Grace hesitated, thinking about the question. 6 months ago, she would have said she was at the beginning of the journey. Now she realized she was somewhere in the middle. No longer the naive dreamer, but not yet the accomplished woman she knew she could become. "I think I'm in the piece that represents transformation," she replied slowly. "The moment when you realize you can be more than you imagined, but you're still discovering exactly what that means." Christopher smiled, that smile that always made her heart race. "And I'm here for whatever comes," he said softly. There was something in the way he spoke that made Grace look at him differently. For months, they had maintained a strictly professional relationship, even when the attraction between them was palpable. But that afternoon, with the golden light of sunset coming through the windows and the studio silent around them, something changed. "Christopher," Grace began, but he shook his head. "Not now," he said gently. "You have a show to prepare, and when all this is over, when you prove to yourself and to the whole world what you're capable of, then we'll talk about other things." Grace felt her face heat up, but she also felt a wave of respect for him. Christopher was putting her dreams first, even when it was obvious he felt something more for her. "Other things?" she repeated, a smile playing on her lips. "Definitely other things," he confirmed, his eyes shining with a promise that made her stomach contract with anticipation. 2 weeks before the show, Grace was standing in the studio at 6 in the morning, observing the 18 pieces of the collection hanging in sequential order. Each one told part of the story she wanted to narrate. Each one represented months of work, dreams, and collaboration. "Ready?" asked Christopher, appearing beside her with 2 coffee cups. "Scared, anxious, hopeful, and determined," Grace replied, accepting the coffee and feeling the warmth spread through her hands. "So yes, I think I'm ready." "Great," Christopher said, "because the world is ready to meet Grace Mitchell." For the first time in months, Grace completely believed those words. The energy at the Metropolitan Fashion Hall was electrifying. Grace could feel the vibration of animated conversations through the backstage walls, the incessant click-clack of cameras being tested, and the unmistakable aroma of expensive perfumes mixed with pure adrenaline. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the pearl necklace on the first model. a gift from Christopher that she had found on her desk that morning, along with a note that simply said, "To remember where you came from and celebrate where you're going." 5 minutes, everyone, shouted Sarah, the backstage coordinator Christopher had hired to ensure everything ran perfectly. Grace looked around at the controlled chaos unfolding around her. 18 models in different stages of preparation, makeup artists applying final touches, assistants running with last-minute shoes and accessories. But at the center of it all, her creations hung on organized racks, each piece a declaration of love for the handmade, the sustainable, the meaningful. "Grace, breathe," said Maria, appearing at her side with a reassuring smile. "Carmen is in the audience with the whole family. Rosa brought her mother. Elena has been crying with pride since she got here." The mention of her artisans made Grace's heart tighten with emotion. They were all there, dressed in their best clothes, occupying seats of honor in the front row that Christopher had reserved especially for them. "And you?" Grace asked Maria. "How are you feeling?" "Like a mother watching her daughter graduate," Maria replied, her eyes shining, proud and terrified at the same time. Christopher appeared backstage, impeccable in his dark tuxedo. His eyes immediately sought Grace, and when they met, he smiled. That smile that always made her feel like she could conquer the world. "The audience is packed," he informed her, approaching. "There are people standing. Journalists from Vogue Paris, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, buyers from Bergdorf Goodman, Saks, even some international ones from Japan and Germany." Grace felt a wave of nausea mixed with pure exhilaration. "Is this real?" she asked, almost whispering. "Very real," Christopher confirmed, gently touching her arm. "And you're ready." 2 minutes, Sarah shouted again. Grace did a final check on each model. The first wore a blazer inspired by what her grandmother used to wear to union meetings, updated with a modern cut and sustainable fabric, but maintaining the essence of quiet feminine power. The second, a dress that told the story of immigrant women through embroidery that mixed techniques from different cultures. "Positions, everyone!" The runway lights came on, and Grace could hear the audience murmur transform into silent expectation. She positioned herself at the side of the stage, where she could see both the models and the audience's reaction. "Ladies and gentlemen," the presenter's voice echoed through the hall, "we present Modern Roots by Grace Mitchell in partnership with Bennett Collective." The first model emerged from backstage and Grace held her breath. The silence that followed lasted only seconds but seemed eternal. Then, like a wave, she heard the first murmur of approval. Cameras fired in rapid sequence. Someone in the audience whispered "gorgeous" loud enough to be heard. One after another, her creations walked down the runway. Grace watched fascinated as each piece came to life on the models' bodies, as the stories she had embroidered in fabric silently communicated with the audience. The fifth piece, a skirt that floated like a cloud, inspired by Grandma Rosa's dances, drew audible sighs from the audience. Grace saw a lady in the third row touch her chest, clearly moved. "My God," she heard Christopher murmur beside her. He had joined her at the side of the stage, and his expression was one of pure pride and something deeper she couldn't name. The 11th piece, an ensemble that represented the modern working woman without sacrificing femininity, made a Japanese buyer lean forward in his chair, clearly interested. But it was the 15th piece that changed everything. It was the dress Grace had created thinking about her own journey. A seemingly simple design that revealed complexity as light hit it from different angles. The embroidery told the story of a woman who falls, gets up, doubts herself, and finally finds her strength. It was autobiographical without being obvious, universal without being generic. When the model wearing it reached the end of the runway and stopped, the audience fell completely silent for a moment that seemed suspended in time. Then something extraordinary happened. Spontaneous applause began in the front row where Carmen was sitting and spread like fire through the entire audience. Grace felt hot tears streaming down her face. Not tears of nervousness or fear, but of pure achievement. She had done it. She had created something that touched people, that spoke to them in a deep and genuine way. The last 3 pieces paraded amid an atmosphere of growing enthusiasm. The 18th and final piece, a wedding dress that reimagined tradition with environmental consciousness, received an ovation that made the walls of the Metropolitan Fashion Hall vibrate. "Grace," Sarah said, appearing at her side with shining eyes, "you need to come out. The audience is calling for the designer." For a moment, Grace hesitated. 6 months ago, she had left a stage humiliated and destroyed. Now she was being called back as a victor. "Go," Christopher said gently, giving her an encouraging nudge. "It's your moment." Grace took a deep breath and walked toward the runway. When she emerged from backstage, the ovation intensified. She saw Carmen crying openly, Maria shouting, "Esa es mi niña!" Rosa applauding so hard it looked like her hands would hurt for days. But it was when she saw some familiar faces in the audience that her heart really raced. David Kellerman was in the 5th row, applauding with an expression of surprise and respect. Helena Moreau, the editor who had called her work quaint, was taking notes furiously in her notebook. Grace walked to the center of the runway, where all her models had gathered. She turned to the audience and took a deep bow, feeling the weight of all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights, all the moments of doubt that had led to this instant. When she straightened up, she searched for Christopher in the crowd and found him at the side of the stage. He wasn't applauding like the others. He was just looking at her with an intensity that made her feel like they were the only two people in the hall. The models began to disperse, but the audience continued applauding. Grace saw journalists approaching with microphones, buyers already signaling to their assistants, photographers capturing every angle of the collection. "Grace, Grace," someone shouted from the audience. "Interview! Vogue wants an interview!" But before Grace could fully process what was happening, she felt a familiar hand touch her arm. Christopher had climbed on stage and was beside her, his smile brighter than she had ever seen. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear amid the commotion. Grace looked at the still applauding audience, at her artisans crying with pride in the front row, at the journalists approaching with questions, at her creations being photographed by dozens of professional cameras. "I feel," she said, smiling through tears, "like I've finally found my voice." Christopher smiled back, and in that moment, Grace knew her life had changed forever. Not just professionally, but in every way that mattered. "Welcome to your world, Grace Mitchell," he said. "I hope you're ready for what comes next." As reporters approached and camera flashes created a kaleidoscope around them, Grace realized that for the first time in her life, she was more than ready. She was radiant. 3 weeks after the runway show, Grace was living in a reality that seemed straight out of a dream. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests, her email inbox overflowed with collaboration proposals, and international magazines competed to be the first to photograph her next creations. The studio, which once housed only 5 women, now buzzed with 15 employees and 3 interns. "Grace Vogue Italia confirmed the photo shoot for next week," announced Lisa, her new personal assistant, a necessity Christopher had insisted on after Grace started working 18 hours a day, trying to handle everything alone. Grace looked up from the table where she was sketching the first drafts of the next collection. The aroma of strong coffee mixed with the scent of roses that Christopher sent every Monday created an atmosphere of luxurious productivity that she still couldn't believe was her real life. "Confirm it," she replied, returning to her sketch, "and ask if they want to include some pieces from the winter collection we're developing." "I already asked," Lisa smiled. "They want total exclusivity, 6 color pages in the December issue." Grace stopped drawing and looked at her assistant, still processing the information. 6 pages in Vogue Italia. 6 months ago, she couldn't even afford a decent meal, and now she was being treated as one of the rising stars of sustainable fashion. "There's more," Lisa continued, consulting her electronic agenda. "The people from Bergdorf Goodman want a meeting on Thursday. They're interested in creating an exclusive section for hopewear in the store." Before Grace could respond, she heard familiar voices coming from the reception area. Carmen and Maria were animatedly discussing embroidery finishes on a blouse in Spanish, their laughter echoing off the glass walls of the new office. "Sorry to interrupt," a familiar voice made Grace freeze completely. Ryan was standing at the studio entrance, impeccably dressed in a blazer she didn't recognize and wearing a smile she had learned to distrust. Sophia wasn't with him this time, but there was something about his posture, more humble, more calculatedly vulnerable, that immediately put Grace on alert. "Ryan," she said, her voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" Lisa looked between the two, clearly sensing the tension in the air. "Do you want me to—" she began. "No, you can keep working," Grace said, not wanting to show weakness by sending her assistant away. "Ryan, you have 2 minutes." He approached the table where she was working, his eyes scanning the space with an expression that mixed admiration and something that looked like envy. "Impressive," he said, gesturing vaguely at the studio. "You really did it." "Did what?" Grace asked, setting her pencil aside and focusing completely on him. "All this," Ryan replied, pointing to the magazines stacked on the table. Vogue, Elle, Harper's Bazaar, all with articles about hopeware. Success, recognition, money, the whole package. Grace studied his face, looking for clues about what he really wanted. Ryan never did anything without a hidden motive. "It's strange," he continued, sitting in a chair without being invited, "how things changed since you met Christopher Bennett." The mention of Christopher's name made something cold settle in Grace's stomach. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. Ryan smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile he used when he knew something she didn't, when he was about to drop an emotional bomb. "Oh, Grace," he said, shaking his head as if he felt sorry for her. "Do you really believe it was coincidence? Him showing up at the fair exactly when you needed help? Offering that incredible opportunity right at the first meeting?" "I don't know what you're talking about," Grace replied, but felt a seed of uneasiness beginning to grow. "Christopher Bennett," Ryan said, pronouncing each syllable as if savoring the name, "is known in the industry for one thing: finding talent in vulnerable situations and turning them into his personal salvation projects." Grace stood up from her chair, feeling a wave of anger begin to rise. "You don't know anything about Christopher or about our partnership." "Our partnership," Ryan repeated, laughing. "Grace, have you ever stopped to think why a man like him, billionaire, handsome, successful, would choose exactly you? A seamstress from Chicago with no formal training, no connections, nothing but some artisanal pieces?" Each word hit Grace like a punch to the stomach. They were the same doubts she had buried deeply, the insecurities she fought to keep silenced. "He saw my talent," she said, but her voice came out less convincing than intended. "Talent," Ryan nodded, as if agreeing. "Of course. But have you considered the possibility that your talent is exactly what he needed for the moment? A touching story of overcoming a poor but talented protégé to improve his company's image?" Grace felt her legs go weak. She leaned against the table, trying to process what Ryan was insinuating. "Think about it, Grace," he continued, his voice taking on an almost gentle tone. "Bennett Collective was facing some criticism about elitism, about serving only wealthy clients. Suddenly you appear, the working-class designer, the Cinderella story of sustainable fashion, perfect for humanizing his brand." "Stop," Grace whispered, but Ryan didn't stop. "And the perfect timing of the romance that's blooming between you two? How convenient. The billionaire CEO and the poor seamstress, what a more sellable narrative for magazines, right?" "It's not like that," Grace said, but her voice trembled. "Grace," Ryan stood up and approached her, his voice becoming almost a whisper. "Do you really think a man like Christopher Bennett would fall for someone like you if you met under normal circumstances? If you weren't the vulnerable little victim he could save?" The words hit Grace like an emotional tsunami. All the insecurities she had fought to overcome, all the doubts about deserving the success she was achieving, everything came back with full force. "You're lying," she said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. Ryan smiled again, that smile she knew so well, the smile of someone who knew they had planted exactly the seed of doubt they wanted. "Am I?" he asked. "Or am I just pointing out what's obvious to everyone except you? Christopher Bennett isn't in love with Grace Mitchell, Grace. He's in love with the idea of saving Grace Mitchell." Grace sat heavily in the chair, suddenly feeling as if all the air had been sucked from the room. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, looking at him. "Because I care about you," Ryan replied, and for the first time since he arrived, he seemed sincere. "I know you don't believe that after everything that happened between us, but I don't want to see you being used again. Not the way I used you." Grace closed her eyes, trying to block out his words, but they echoed in her mind like a poisonous mantra. "Just ask yourself one question," Ryan said, heading toward the exit. "If Christopher met you today, successful, established, not needing salvation, would he still be interested in you? Or were you interesting only when you were a charity project?" He stopped at the door and turned one last time. "Grace, you deserve someone who loves you for who you are, not for what you represent for his image. Think about it." And then he was gone, leaving Grace alone with her toxic thoughts and a terrible doubt growing in her chest. Lisa approached hesitantly. "Grace, are you okay? Do you want me to cancel this afternoon's appointments?" Grace looked at her assistant, but her mind was millions of miles away. She was reliving every moment with Christopher, the way he appeared at the fair, the instant offer of help, the way he always seemed to know exactly what to say. Could it be possible that Ryan was right, that she was just a well-executed public relations project? "Grace," Lisa repeated, concern clear in her voice. "I'm fine," Grace lied, turning her attention back to the drawings on the table. But the lines seemed blurred now, as if she were seeing everything through a fog of uncertainty. For the first time in months, Grace wondered if she really knew the man she was falling in love with, or if she was in love with a carefully constructed illusion. Grace spent 2 whole days avoiding Christopher. She cancelled meetings, asked Lisa to reschedule appointments, and locked herself in the studio working compulsively on new designs, anything to avoid having to face the questions Ryan had planted in her mind, like poisonous seeds. But on Wednesday morning, Christopher simply showed up. "Grace, I need to talk to you," he said, entering the studio with a determination she hadn't seen before. His clothes were wrinkled as if he had slept in them, and there was an intensity in his green eyes that made her stop drawing instantly. "Now isn't a good time," Grace replied, not looking up from the paper. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to continue drawing lines that made no sense. "Grace!" His voice was firm, but not harsh. "Look at me." She hesitated for a moment that seemed eternal, then slowly raised her face. Christopher was standing on the other side of the table, his hands resting on the glass surface, and there was something in his expression, a mixture of frustration, concern, and something deeper, that made her heart race. "Lisa told me about Ryan's visit," he said directly. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. She had instructed Lisa not to mention the incident to anyone, but obviously the assistant had been concerned enough to seek out Christopher. "She had no right to—" "She had every right," Christopher interrupted, "because she cares about you, just like I do, and because it's obvious that whatever he said is destroying you from the inside." Grace stood up from her chair, suddenly feeling like the studio was too small to contain all the tension growing between them. "He said you were using me," she blurted out all at once, as if it were better to rip off a band-aid quickly. "That I was just a well-executed public relations project, that you wouldn't be interested in me if it weren't for the touching story of the poor seamstress you could save." Christopher became completely still for a few seconds. Then, to Grace's surprise, he laughed. But it wasn't a happy laugh. It was a bitter sound, loaded with hurt. "And you believed him," Christopher said. It wasn't a question. Grace began, but the words died in her throat. "Grace, do you really believe I spent the last 8 months of my life pretending feelings to improve my company's image?" The pain in his voice hit her like a slap. Grace looked at Christopher, really looked at him, and saw something that made her feel terrible. He was hurt, deeply hurt. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she admitted, her voice coming out as a whisper. Christopher walked to the window, turning his back to her. For a long moment, only the sound of the artisan sewing machines downstairs broke the tense silence between them. "Do you want to know the truth?" he asked finally, without turning around. "The complete truth?" Grace nodded, even knowing he couldn't see her. "Yes," she said out loud. Christopher turned to face her, and Grace saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a raw vulnerability that made her realize he was about to reveal something deeply personal. "Ryan is right about one thing," Christopher began, and Grace felt her stomach sink. "I wasn't at the fair by chance." Grace leaned against the table, preparing for the worst. "Bennett Collective was going through a transition phase," he continued, his voice becoming more controlled, more businesslike. "We were growing, but growing in a soulless way. We were sustainable, ethical, but without soul. Our products were perfect, but not personal. I was looking for someone who could help us remember why we had started. Grace felt tears beginning to form. So you were looking for someone like me? No, Christopher said firmly. I was looking for you. Grace blinked, confused. I don't understand. Christopher approached her, but maintained a respectful distance. Grace, I knew who you were before that fair. I had seen your work online, had read about your story with Ryan, had researched emerging designers who were doing truly meaningful work. You were on my list of people I wanted to meet. Grace's world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. You knew who I was? I did, Christopher confirmed. But when I saw you in that hallway, desperate to avoid your ex, I didn't approach you as CEO of Bennett Collective. I simply helped a woman who needed help. And then when we talked, when you showed me your creations, Grace, you reminded me why I fell in love with fashion in the first place. Grace sat heavily in the chair, trying to process this new information. But why didn't you tell me before? Because, Christopher let out air in a long exhale, I wanted you to know you were capable of achieving everything on your own before discovering that I had believed it from the beginning. I wanted you to feel secure in your own ability before knowing that I had never doubted it. He moved closer, his eyes fixed on hers. Grace, do you think I would fake 8 months of this? He gestured vaguely between them. Do you think I would fake the way my heart races every time you enter a room? That I would invent the reasons why I wake up thinking about you every morning? Grace felt tears finally overflow. I was scared, she admitted. Scared it was too good to be true. Scared I didn't deserve all this. Christopher took another step toward her. And there's one last thing you need to know, he said, taking an envelope from his blazer's inner pocket. Something I should have given you weeks ago, but was waiting for the right moment. Grace looked at the envelope suspiciously. What is it? Open it. With trembling hands, Grace opened the envelope and pulled out several legal documents. As she read, her eyes widened progressively. Christopher, this is the complete transfer of Hopeware's rights to you, he confirmed. Not just the creations, but all the infrastructure, contracts, international agreements, everything. The company is yours, Grace. It always was yours, but now it's officially and legally yours. Grace looked at the papers, then at him, then at the papers again. I don't understand. Why would you do this? Because, Christopher said, a gentle smile finally appearing on his face, I fell in love with a woman who builds empires with her own hands, and I want to make sure she always knows the empire is hers, regardless of whether I'm in it or not. Grace slowly stood up, the documents still in her hands. What if I choose to keep everything and send you away? Christopher laughed, a genuine and rich sound. Then I'll hope you're happy and successful, and I'll consider myself very lucky to have known you. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the billionaire CEO, not the savior Ryan had described, but simply Christopher, the man who brought coffee every morning, who learned the names of all her artisans, who never once tried to change her creative vision. You're an idiot, she said. But she was smiling through tears. Why? Christopher asked, confused. Because, Grace said, putting the documents on the table and walking toward him, any smart person would know that I'm already yours, that I've been yours for months, and that these papers don't change that. Christopher looked at her with an intensity that made her feel like she was catching fire inside. Grace, no, she said, placing her hand on his chest. My turn to talk. Ryan was wrong. About you, about us, about everything. Because I know you, Christopher. I see you. And the man I see is someone who respects my dreams enough to give me complete control over them. Someone who loves me strong enough to let me go if I want to. Christopher placed his hand over hers. And do you want to? Go away? Grace smiled, and this time it was a smile that reached her eyes and completely transformed her face. Not in a million years, she said. Because I discovered something about myself these last months. I discovered that I'm strongest when I'm with you. Not because I need you to save me, but because you inspire me to save myself. Christopher smiled back, that smile that always made her heart race. So, he said, what happens next? Grace looked at the documents on the table, then at the studio around them, then again at the man who had become much more than a business partner. Next, she said, we build this together, as equals. 1 year later, Grace was standing in the office she had chosen to house Hopeware. Not in New York, as many expected, but in Chicago, just 9 miles from the neighborhood where she had grown up with Grandma Rosa. The windows on the 12th floor offered a panoramic view of the city that had shaped her, and Grace could see in the distance the roof of the house where she had learned her first stitches. The familiar smell of new fabrics mixed with the aroma of artisanal coffee, now a daily tradition Christopher maintained, even while living between Chicago and New York, created an atmosphere of professional home that she had never imagined possible. "Grace, the foundation team has arrived," announced Marcus, her new operations manager. A brilliant young man who had left a position at Ralph Lauren to work with her, attracted as much by the company's philosophy as by the competitive salary she could now offer. Grace looked around the open office that had become Hopeware's heart. 72 employees worked in 3 shifts, all receiving fair wages, full benefits, and profit sharing. Carmen, now director of embroidery, supervised a team of 15 artisans. Maria had become production manager, ensuring that each piece maintained the handmade quality standard that had become the brand's signature. "Send them up," Grace replied, adjusting the blazer she wore. Her own creation in organic linen with embroidery that told the story of her journey, from the first desperate embrace with Christopher to this moment of complete fulfillment. A few minutes later, Christopher entered the room accompanied by 3 people Grace recognized immediately. Dr. Sarah Nakamura, specialist in sustainable development; Roberto Santos, former CEO of an NGO focused on microcredit for underserved communities; and Jessica Chen, a young prodigy in social impact who had left McKinsey to dedicate herself to causes that truly mattered. "Grace," Christopher said, his smile radiating pride and something deeper she had learned to recognize as unconditional love, "I'd like to officially introduce the board of the Bennett Mitchell Foundation." The foundation's name still made her smile. When Christopher had proposed combining their names for the initiative, Grace had insisted she didn't need the recognition. He had responded that it wasn't about recognition, but about true partnership, something he wanted the whole world to know about. "Dr. Nakamura," Grace greeted the elegant 50-year-old woman, "I've read all your articles on sustainability and fashion. It's an honor to have you with us." "The honor is mine, Grace," Sarah replied, her gentle Japanese accent making the words even warmer. "What you've built here is exactly the model we need to replicate globally." Grace looked out the window at the street below, where she could see a small crowd forming in front of Hopeware's new training center. They were women of all ages, coming from different neighborhoods in Chicago, all interested in the sewing training program that had become one of the company's most beloved projects. "How many candidates do we have for this class?" Grace asked Marcus. 243 registered for 20 spots, he replied, consulting his tablet. "The waiting list already has over 500 people." Grace shook her head, still amazed by the numbers. The program had started as a small initiative, teaching sewing techniques to women in situations of social vulnerability. Now, program graduates were opening their own businesses, some being hired directly by Hopeware, others creating independent brands with mentorship from the foundation. "And the international program?" asked Roberto Santos. "How are the negotiations with Brazil going?" Christopher and Grace exchanged a look. This was one of the news that excited them most. "Confirmed," Grace replied, unable to hide the excitement in her voice. "We're opening our first international center in São Paulo next year. Partnership with a women's cooperative that produces organic cotton in the interior. They'll supply raw materials. We'll provide training and access to the international market." Jessica Chen leaned forward, clearly interested. "And the financial sustainability model? How do you ensure the program self-finances in the long term?" "That was the most challenging part," Christopher replied, but Grace had a brilliant idea. Grace smiled, remembering the nights she had spent developing the concept. "Each training center also functions as a concept store," she explained. "The products created by the students are sold locally, and a percentage of the profits goes back to finance new classes. It's a self-sustaining cycle that economically empowers participants while expanding the program." Dr. Nakamura nodded approvingly. "Brilliant. It combines social impact with economic viability, exactly the kind of innovation the sector needs." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, discussing implementation details, impact metrics, and expansion plans. When they finally finished, the sun was already setting over Chicago, tinting the office with golden tones that made the fabrics displayed on the walls shine like works of art. "Grace," Christopher said when they were alone in the office, "can I ask you a question?" "Always," she replied, organizing the meeting papers. "Do you remember what you said on the first day we worked together? About changing the world one stitch at a time?" Grace stopped what she was doing and looked at him. There was something in his expression that made her pay full attention. "I remember." "You know you did it, don't you?" Christopher said, walking to the window where he could see the movement at the training center entrance. 72 employees here in Chicago, 240 graduates from the program in the last year, confirmed partnerships in 6 countries. "Grace, you're no longer changing the world one stitch at a time. You're changing the world." Grace joined him at the window, watching the women leaving the training center with radiant faces and bags full of materials to practice at home. "No," she said softly, "we're changing the world." Christopher smiled and put his arm around her waist, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "And what's the next step?" he asked. Grace looked at the city stretching before her, at the buildings where thousands of women lived their own struggles and nurtured their own dreams. She thought about the girls who were still learning to sew on their grandmother's laps, about women who doubted their own talents, about stories that hadn't yet been told through needle and thread. "The next step," she said, her voice loaded with determination and hope, "is to remind every woman we meet that her roots don't limit her, they give her wings." Christopher gently kissed the top of her head. "And how do you feel about all this?" he asked. "About becoming exactly who you always dreamed of being." Grace closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the full weight of her journey. From a devastated young woman in a hostel room to an entrepreneur who employed hundreds of people and impacted thousands of lives. From someone who questioned her own worth to a woman who knew, without a shadow of doubt, that she deserved every achievement. "I feel," she said, opening her eyes and smiling, "like I finally understood what Grandma Rosa meant when she talked about sowing hope." "And what did she mean?" Grace turned to Christopher, her eyes shining with tears of pure happiness. "That every stitch we take in life's fabric creates possibilities for someone to feel stronger, more beautiful, more powerful. And when we manage to do that for other people," she paused, gently touching his face, "we discover that, in the process, we sowed hope into our own lives too." Christopher smiled, that smile that had become her home, her security, her happiness. "Forever?" he asked, echoing a question that had become ritual between them. "Forever," Grace confirmed, sealing the promise with a kiss that carried the taste of dreams fulfilled and infinite futures. Outside, Chicago awakened to another night, and somewhere in the city, a young woman was learning her first stitch, not yet knowing that she was taking the first step toward wings that would take her far beyond her roots. Grace's story teaches us that there are no accidental embraces. Sometimes our moments of greatest despair lead us exactly where we need to be. She discovered that the roots we think limit us are, in fact, the ones that give us the strength to fly higher. And she learned that true love doesn't save us. It inspires us to save ourselves while we build something beautiful together. Because maybe in the end, we're all like Grace, one desperate embrace away from finding our destiny. The question that remains is, when life presents us with that moment of pure desperation, will we have enough courage to embrace a stranger and whisper, "Pretend you know me"? If this story moved you, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us, where are you listening to this message from? Your support is what allows us to continue bringing stories like this.